if I gave you the reins of card design, like what kind of improvement or change would you make to the game currently? Or is there a card you would
Um,
change? Is
okay, so
there
let's
overall
go into
mechanic change?
collection since we're going down the list. So,
Let's do it.
um, for let's say for Lionar, the only thing that I don't have any Lionar cards, so I disenchanted everything to make my Abyss deck. Because I figured if it's only going to be one class of tournament, you might as well just disenchant everything to make the deck that you're going to play until the reset or the patch or whatever. So, that's kind of what I'm going. Plus, just don't have that many cards. But anyway, I honestly feel like Lionar is in a really good place right now, and I feel like my sentiments are mirrored outside of maybe Lion having too much attack damage. Because it's the only unit with both Celerity and Rush.
Yeah.
And its stats are kind of tweaked in that way. But I think going down to 2 damage would be alright. Because although it is one of their only options against some of the worst matchups, and it also gives them a lot of reach, it just might be a little bit too much. But I don't feel like the health number should be changed at all, because 5 is just outside the number of attacks it takes to kill it on 2 counterattacks. And 3 is just enough to kill most early drops. But if it was down to 2, it would be a little bit easier to deal with, I suppose. And dying from hand is just a really frustrating experience a lot of the time, but at least with Lionar, it's a static number. And so reducing that number doesn't seem like it's an awful thing for Lionar because so many of their other things allow them to get, or their other options rather, I use the word things, but they have a lot of powerful options already. And it feels like the Lion, although I think that it needs to exist, probably shouldn't deal as much damage. Because they have so many ways of doing well when they're already in range of someone. This is their best option for dealing with targets that are out of range, but when you look at Divine Bond, you can give the Lion +5 on top of it, and so in total does 16 damage out of hand for 8 mana and 2 cards. So it's a really strong burst option for a class that is mostly concerned about just holding the board and pushing forward. So I guess that's the only thing I would look at as far as Lionar is concerned. So for Songhai, oh god, I could write a book about
You're
this.
like delete the faction. I'm like, whoa, whoa.
No.
No.
Well, it's just that the current optimal Songhai usage revolves around Spiral Tech and
Yeah.
Phoenix Fire and pretty much 34 other cards. So if I had to hit anything, it would be Spiral Technique. I would retain the damage to a minion, but either deal less to the general, or it does damage based on how much health the creature has. So, okay, let's say that you Spiral Technique a 2/3, then it'll deal 3 damage. If you Spiral Technique something with 5 health, then it'll deal 5 damage. But anything over 5, and it just does 5. Because that way, Spiral Teching a Sarlacc isn't a play. Like,
Yeah.
it really shouldn't be a play. If you're
Yeah.
dumping 5 mana to not kill something because you want to deal 5 damage, it shouldn't be an optimal play, but it is right now because if you do it 3 times, they're down to 10 health.
Yeah.
And so that just doesn't feel very good. And I know it's a very specific example given that I'm an Abyssian player, so this actually comes up more often than you'd think, but it just doesn't feel like that should be a play. And I feel like it should be an option for Songhai in the later phases of the game to be able to do both damage and removal, such like Spiral Technique, but it shouldn't be so good on its own that if you kill something that is just overkilling it just because you want the nuke for 5 mana, if that's actually healthy. Because if you look at and it also gives some counterplay to Spiral Technique, because right now, Spiral Tech is almost always a good play on 5. This is always probably going to be minions, and you're always probably going to want to deal damage to their face. It's never a bad idea to use Spiral Technique, almost. Sometimes Spiral Tech doesn't do enough if you're losing too much, and if the other class has healing. So that's the other thing that I feel like a card like 8 Gates is actually helping to do with Songhai, is giving them options on saving their cards so that they can deal more damage later. But as it is right now, I don't really see current Songhai players or playstyle using it with that with that intention. They're just like, oh look, I top decked 8 gates with the damage spell. Cool,
More
another.
damage.
Yeah, more damage. That's it. It doesn't like what it's supposed to do is encourage the players to save their cards to do more damage later, but it's just looking like it's another burn spell in a burn deck. Like that's all it is.
Yeah.
And so if we hit the burn spells a little more, then this card becomes a little bit more involved because saving your spells might actually be worthwhile if you have 3 of them. Or in the other case with Deceptical, like say if he steals a spell from me and he uses 8 gates on that, like I think that's a really cool play, right? And he didn't get to do it, or maybe like he doesn't have enough copies of 8 gates, but that's a really interesting way to use 8 gates.
Yeah.
And there are actually interesting gameplay options with Songhai, but they're completely thrown on the wayside because all they have to do is burn you.
Yeah.
And there's so many of these other cards that just like aren't to their win condition, like Celestial Phantom. I've never seen this card played, but it's amazing. You can use Phantom and say if it sticks to the board for a turn, and it might because it's a 1/5. I think the only class that can really handle it immediately is Magmar. And so this 1/5 for 3 can kill anything. And if you combine it with a spell like Inner Focus, you can kill multiple things in a turn. I keep using the word thing. Sorry. But I feel like a lot of their plays are stifled by the optimum playstyle just being click on their face. And so with these, I guess, recently there's been buffs to the class even to encourage the alternative playstyles, but it's just that they haven't hit the core problem of Songhai, which is that their burn is too high. If you add all of their burn spells together, you have 3 from Phoenix Spire, and the 15 from Spiral Technique, or sorry, 9 plus 15, 24, right? They have 24 damage worth of burn that takes 0 interactivity throughout the deck, and that's just regular burn, right? You have Saber Spine Steel, it's another 9 damage. If you combine it with Inner Focus, that's another 9 damage on top of that. So, like, all this damage is just coming from nowhere, and the only option that you have as any other class is to just put healing in your deck.
Yeah.
And Lionar has really good options for that. They have Sundrop Elixir. Songhai has among the worst healing options, and I feel like that should be a definitive weakness for the classes, that Bloodleech Mask is their only healing, right? So their defenses are weak. But they do have a class taunt, I guess, a class-specific taunt card. And so that kind of mitigates the problem, and this is probably one of the best early game creatures in the game, if left unsilenced or what have you.
Yeah.
And so it sort of mitigates their issue, but it doesn't solve the issue of having a low amount of general health. Vitruvian has, I would say, the third worst, or sorry, if we're gonna rank them by healing amounts, I'll put Lionar in. Okay, so you gotta look at it 2 ways, I suppose. So Magmar can heal for 30, but for 12 mana, right?
Yeah.
And Lionar can heal for 15 for 0. So as far as overall like long game healing, Magmar wins out #1 healing class if you want to look at it that way. Lionar, okay, we put Magmar and Lionar kind of first, second, right? And then Vitruvian is third, has 12 healing overall with Fountain of Youth. And I think Fountain of Youth is kind of an interesting card now, but before it was basically free, and now it costs mana, but it also draws you cards, so it's very effective. But it's also not like it does 2 things at once, so it's weaker at just healing. So they have 12 healing in their deck for 6 mana, and Abyssian has 9 healing in their deck for 3. They're, I guess you could say, a more offensively leaning class, and so having less of a heal makes sense for them. And so Abyssian basically has the second worst healing in the game, and such probably the worst matchup against Songhai. But there's no alternative options. You have no way of dealing with burn outside of Void Pulse, unless you want to use the only neutral card in the game that heals you, Sunseer, which does nothing besides that, and it doesn't heal you enough. It also has to attack something, which means if it's removed by something like, say, Spiral Technique, then it heals you for nothing. So if you want to tackle the Songhai problem, I feel like the main way that you have to look at it is there's not enough healing, not enough neutral healing to combat the amount of damage that Songhai has simply from spells. If you add more neutral healing options, that might be one way. Changing cards like Void Pulse or Fountain of Youth, or adding an additional healing spell to certain classes could also mitigate that issue. And there are Songhai deck variations that can deal with Lionar and Magmar such that they aren't just fighting against the green numbers with their red numbers, which
Yeah.
is what the matchup is described as oh, I just can't burn them down because they can heal and they have taunts. Well, yeah, but you also have creatures that can instantly kill other creatures, and you have Heaven's Eclipse, which does an obscene amount of damage to minions, and Onyx Bear Seal, but you're not using them because burn is the optimum strategy for the class.
Yeah, because you're just going for face.
Right. So it's more of the least interactive approach is currently the strongest one for Songhai, rather than Songhai not having any options. It just doesn't. It feels like they have options, and maybe they aren't strong enough. Maybe Onyx Bear Seal could be reduced to 2 mana. Maybe Celestial Phantom could have more health or something like that. But you have to look at the burn first. Because if no one is interested in playing these alternative playstyles, you're not really going to see a change. So that's my Songhai diatribe. Uh, Rito, please nerf.
So Vitruvian.
Okay, so Vitruvian, there's a lot of things that I feel need to be done with this class. Since I played it a bit, we'll start with the back. So Time Maelstrom, I feel like either it shouldn't exist in its current form. Now it feels like a really niche spell where sometimes it can end a game, but a lot of the time it's kind of clunking your hand. So maybe it's a conscious deck choice to have Time Maelstrom in your deck, because now it isn't as cost free as it once was when it was 6 mana. Now you kind of have to have a plan with Time Maelstrom, because if you have nothing on the board with Time Maelstrom, even old Time Maelstrom, it really didn't do that much. It gave you 1 extra mana, and at 8 mana, the 1 extra mana doesn't mean a difference at all, right? And it also gave you enough mana to play something. So right now, you can't actually place anything with Time Maelstrom unless you reduce its cost.
Yeah.
But that being said, I would rather that it had less cost, but one of the effects of an extra turn being negated. So, like, say if it's 7 mana, but you don't draw extra cards, or you don't gain another mana crystal, or you don't get to attack again, then you have something different, right?
Yeah.
And let's say that Time Maelstrom costed 7, but or maybe even 6. If everything couldn't attack, it would cost 6. If you didn't gain mana, maybe it would cost 7. Or if you didn't draw cards, maybe it would cost 7. Maybe that's the deal. But as it is now, it just feels like it'll win you the game sometimes, but you probably would have already won the game with anything else that was the same strength as an 8 mana card. But
Yeah.
it's more restricted. So this might have been a band-aid fix for Time Maelstrom while they figure out what they really want to do with it, and that's fine. Ostrix is really strange in that for 7 mana, you really need something to have an effect when it hits the board. And if you're playing Vitruvian and you're playing a 7-cost card, it better do something good. And in Ostrix, in this flying minion that
Yeah.
also equips 2 artifacts to your general when it dies. In the case of Ostrix, it doesn't do enough when it hits the board, and so you don't really feel inclined to even put it in your deck.
Yeah, I would agree.
If it survives for a turn, it can fly anywhere and hit something. That's pretty nice. And getting the artifacts is really strong, right? But there's no way to make this effect any better for you. That's all it is. It's just a strong minion, but it doesn't do enough on turn 7. On turn 7, I'm dead to Songhai already. Abyssian has the board. Magmar will probably just kill it in some way. And Lionar just simply doesn't care about it, because by that point they can probably taunt us. They can probably taunt it, or they have enough board where that isn't necessarily a threat. Although
Yeah.
actually, maybe against Lionar it's maybe the best, because you can play Keep Away, or you should be playing Keep Away with it. And so by the time you hit 7 mana, you can play it in a corner wherever you are and just let it sit there, and they can't deal with it immediately. But you don't have the same threat level in the end game with Ostrix as Lionar has with Lion.
Yeah.
Lion does so much out of hand that they're not comparable, and Ostrix is legendary. It's 7 mana, and it also it has more stats. But yet it dwarfs in comparison in terms of usage. Enslave, another one of the big Vitruvian cards that got hit really hard, and I feel like this was a fairly reasonable nerf, although, again, same thing with the 7 mana issue is if you get to 7 mana as Vitruvian, either you're playing a control mirror and they can play around Enslave. If they basically all you need to do to play around Enslave is place your minions in kind of a diagonal formation in between you and your general and their general, and there's no way they can reach it outside of using Silhouette Tracer. But if you do that, then you can't use Enslave.
Yeah.
So, but I do feel like Enslave needs a buff. But if you buff Enslave, you have to nerf something else because right now Vitruvian does have a viable mid-game playstyle. It's just that the control aspects of Vitruvian got hit really hard, and this was one of those cards. So I would like to see. Well, it really depends on, I guess, the structure of the class and how they want the class to be designed. Because if you want Vitruvian to have viable control options, Ostrix isn't it. Time Maelstrom currently isn't it. But Time Maelstrom I feel is more of like a finisher for an endgame, or sorry, for a mid game deck than an end game. Let me push out my Time Maelstroms type deck.
Yeah.
But for Enslave is a late game control card. It does a lot against something like Lionar if they don't have Spell Shield for it or something like that. Magmar perhaps, but most classes have ways of making plays out of hand that completely circumvent Enslave. And the simplest way is to just diagonally place your unit in between your general and their general, and they can't enslave it, and that cannot change, because you can't change the position of the enemy general yet. Maybe you can. Yeah, maybe in the future that would be possible, but that would be insanely strong. Because if it was an Abyssian and you had like really big demonic lure for 5, I would play that every time. I would play that 3 copies, and it would just be the strongest card ever.
Yeah, you're like, hey, Lionar General, now you're away from all your Zeal units, or
they all die.
You want to do, yeah.
So there just can't be a way to move the enemy general unless you move them a number of spaces. Maybe that's a way to do it, or maybe a classic Magmar could have that.
Yeah.
But as it is right now, Enslave's requirements are too easy to play around for as strong as it is to just have a completely 100% playable option at any point. Oh, they're running Enslave in their deck. All right, I'm gonna put this guy here. Good luck. And the guy has Enslave in his hand. Is like, oh, come on. And most units, I feel like if you're playing a late game deck, you don't want most of your units to actually need to attack anything for them to be good. So, for instance, Dark Nemesis. If I play Dark Nemesis on the corner with my general and Enslave can't touch it, Dark Nemesis still does something.
Yeah.
But a card like Ostrix doesn't really. I mean, it can fly after, so that's probably a little bit of a bad example. But generally, most legendaries will do something, even if they're not in range to attack it. And so Enslave at 7 really hurts Enslave. Let's move on.
Yeah.
Scion's Third Wish, really strong card. I don't think I would change it. It's a really nice endgame option for Vet as far as removal goes, and it's pretty difficult to play around, but it's also kind of a risk for the Vitruvian to run it because it's a 6 mana removal. So it has to do something good. Amara Healer is probably the biggest offender for the class as far as how strong one card can be, because it's a 6/6 that does 6 that also heals 6.
Yeah, if you don't have an answer, it's a lot. It's a big gap that it creates.
Yeah, it's a game-endingly good card against certain classes. There used to be a lot easier time, there were a lot better tech cards against it before, when you had Repulsor Beast and Ephemeral Shroud easily techable into a deck because you cycled them so quickly. It wasn't really a negative deck choice to have them. Now, if you have things like Repulsor Beast and Ephemeral Shrouds in your deck, it's not as good of a deck choice.
Yeah, it's like if that's what you start with, it's like not very great. It's something they're cards you kind of want to hold, and so a lot of times you can end up in situations where it's like, all right, I start the game, my only playable creature is an Ephemeral Shroud, yay! But
right, and sometimes people will play the Ephemeral Shroud and wish they never had the card in the first place. So Amara Healer punishes having a low amount of tech in your deck, and I think that this card hasn't been changed since I've started the game, and that was because beforehand Amara Healer was sort of a risk, because you play 6 mana, and if they play a 2 mana ephemeral, you're screwed. And that was your turn. They're cycling out 4 cards a turn. You play your 1 Amari healer on 6, you get 1 card back. That might not be enough.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I would call a design relic. Not relic. Yeah, relic is a good way to put it. I suppose, where it's artifact. It's a design artifact. So
Yeah.
it was left behind by all of the other changes, and so this card is still a 6/6 for 6 that heals 6 and does 6 because it was such a risky choice before. But now it's probably the strongest card in the class. If unanswered, is probably the strongest card in the game. I'm trying to think if there's anything well, maybe Spiral Technique, but depends on who you ask.
There's no answering a Spiral Technique. There's only accepting.
Right. So our first group. Well, sorry.
So yeah, you're talking about like a lot of like the heavy side of the faction is the problem. Like,
right.
Would you agree that like they're cheat, like they're dervishes, like that's kind of like where their strength is. Like Dunecaster's super efficient. They have a lot of like really good low cost stuff. Or
okay, let's go to that then. So their low cost is kind of a keep away game. They don't want to play an obelisk in your face, for instance, and so they'll try to rely on obelisks, pyromancers, and such Wildfire Onyx to stay, I guess, in the back and try to use efficiency to get themselves out of the early game and to push their board. Because these obelisks will stay even if they're behind the general doing absolutely nothing. It's still a piece of the map that they control. And so for each obelisk that they have out on the board, for each pyromancer played in the back, you have to answer them or you'll eventually lose the board anyway. But most classes do have ways of dealing with obelisk or pyromancer, and I would even point to Bulletier Alchemist as being one of the best cards against Vitruvian in general, because you can use it like to ping off their artifacts, which they rely on a lot in the early game. You can use it to ping off pyromancers, and the 2/1, although not a breadwinner by any stretch of the imagination, is more or less your answer to pyromancer. And pyromancer is sometimes the only way that they get out of the early game against certain classes. For instance, Abyssian. There's not really a true AoE for Vitruvian that you can't play around. So they have Bone Swarm, which does damage around the enemy general. That's fine. If I'm playing Abyssian against Vet, I will just place all my guys about 1 square ahead of me if I can. So if I've already got things on the board, I'll place everything about a square ahead of me if at all possible. And Bone Swarm then will do nothing, because it only affects around my general, and I don't even need to be near Vitruvian to win the game as Abyss. All you need to do is wait for you to have a chance to kill off all your tokens, and that will deal the direct damage you need to win the game. As far as... I guess it's more of a matchup-specific thing, but going back into AoE, so Bone Swarm is somewhat easy for certain classes to play around. Not Lionar, though. It actually, like, Lionar cannot deal with Bone Swarm. But at the same time, Lionar's units are tanky enough where Bone Swarm isn't the main offender. I would say more or less Siphon Energy is probably the biggest, and Dre Morale. And the instant removal of... so Entropic Decay is one. And the other thing that Lionar can't deal with is Staff. You can just staff their 3/5.
Yeah, there's still a Guard Knight.
And you still have 2 staff charges left. Lionar is probably one of the weakest classes against weapons, I would say. Strange as that sounds. They don't really have that great of a way to kill weapons, and Staff is one of the best because it also kills Lion in 1 hit. Yep. So you can equip a Staff and you protect yourself from dying to Lion. But going back to the Obelisk game, you can play really far back as Bet, but you don't have true AoE. And all the AoE that you have can be played around in some way. Stars Fury only summons things in front of minions. So if you play them in a line, then they can't Stars Fury. And you can also place them in a line 2 squares away from the general, and if there are no blasts, then they can't do anything. If there are no blasts on the board, they can't kill a line of units. Even if they have a relic in hand or a weapon in hand, if you play it 2 squares away, or rather, I guess 3 squares away. So if they're sitting in the center, it's a lot harder, but if they move either direction, you can play around Blast completely. And I hear that most of the case that people make for Vitruvian is that you can't play around Blast and Stars Fury. It really depends on the position of their general. If their general's in the middle, that's the worst. But you can bait out Blast by playing things to the side of your general that need to be blasted. But that's, I guess, really tech specific. So I put the 1/2s against Vitruvian, the archers, because they counterattack blast and they need to be blasted.
Yeah.
That's the only way they can deal with them outside of Star's Fury. So no matter what, I get a charge off their blast, and I get to see their blast, and I get to make their general move up 1 square to kill it, or 2 squares even, which means I can play everything else in the bottom squares, and he can't kill it. So I feel like there's options for you to play around it, but it's really complicated and very techy. Like, you have to tech into it. So if you're playing it on the ladder and like, oh no, I probably can't beat Vet because I don't have this and that, that might be what you need to look at when you want to balance Vet, is how do I make it so that my opponents don't need to tech so many ridiculous things just to deal with my cards. And MR Healer is like the epitome of that. You need to have tech for Amara, or you will probably lose, unless you can just burn them to death.
Yeah.
So yeah, so basically you have to do something.
I can tell you that I have actually praised the fact that she has 6 health when I play Songhai, and I just spiral technique her and she still lives. I'm like, great. Like, as long as I can finish off of that, it's fine. But yeah, most of the times, like, the way to deal with her, as long as she's not in your generals, like, you basically like, all right, her. Yeah, ignore her, and like, if she can't kill herself, then you're fine.
Right. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because against Abyssine, what I used to always do as Vet is just place the Amaras on top of creep.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's actually pretty smart.
And there was nothing you could do about it. They had to like leash them away from the creep, and I'd keep putting them back on the creep. Like, no, we're not playing this game. Here, come back here. And that was fun.
That actually is pretty amusing. Let's dive into Abyss.
Okay.
Because this is the faction you're playing a lot of now. So
yes. So I'll go over as many cards as I would like to go over, I suppose. So. Darkfire Sacrifice, I used to think this card was really bad because if you needed to make a Darkfire Sac deck, then that meant that if you didn't have Darkfire Sac, you were a slave to your curve. And if you're a slave to your mana curve, you're probably screwed, because you actually need to have a mana advantage as Abyssine in some fashion. Or you can rush them. But the way that I look at mana advantage is like this. So Darkfire Sac gives you 3 mana. This is essentially what it does. Yeah. It gives you 3 mana, but it also gives you 3 mana worth of tempo on the same turn. So it's better than just having 3 mana. At least 3 mana on one turn. It's just like, it's almost as close as you can get to Innervate, as far as creatures goes. I guess bringing back as an example from Hearthstone, Innervate just gives you 2 mana, but this one gives you 3, but you have to kill something to get it, which isn't really a problem for Abyss. I would kill every single creature that I possibly could to get 3 more to play more creatures if I had the cards to play after.
Yeah.
So now I think the card's really good, so long as you make your deck. If you tune your deck enough so that you have plays outside of Darkfire Sacrifice, and the deck that I was playing earlier was it was actually very tuned to beat Songhai, and it doesn't even matter. Like, I actually tested for 6 hours a couple days ago against a Song player, and there was the one that beat me in the tournament. I played him like an unreasonable amount of times and wanted to break something, but I made this deck specifically to beat Songhai, and it still doesn't beat Songhai. But point was, Darkfire Sacrifice was the key. You can push out more mana worth of things in a single turn, which means that they need more mana to kill it, which gives you a kind of rolling mana advantage that you can use in a lot of different ways. So let's say that I Darkfire Sack something that they need to remove. We'll use a basic example, like a Deepfire Devourer. And let's say he comes out as a 6/6. It's like, oh god, I need to kill this 6/6. And say I'm playing against another Abyssinian. That's probably the best example because their removal costs exactly 4. But if I use Darkfire Sack to get the Deepfire Devourer out, I'm ahead 3 mana now. So that 3 mana went into something like a Wraithling Storm. So now I'm a Wraithling Storm up on the guy that had to remove my 6/6. And if he doesn't remove the 6/6, then that 6/6 stays. That guy is always going to be worth that amount of mana to me. So, or rather, that amount of mana to them. So I now have that mana advantage going into the next turn as I continue to play more that they have to deal with. And then at some point, you have enough on the board that you can cash in all of that advantage that you had from the beginning to the end and kill them in one turn. Um, but it feels a little bit more honest in its, well, nothing about gaining 3 mana worth of anything is honest, but um, it feels a little bit more honest in the sense that when you play against Abyssian, you know what you need to do. You
Yeah.
need to kill as many things as possible every turn, and that's your goal. And my goal as Abyssian is to make sure that you can't remove everything in one turn. And that is what Darkfire Sacrifice allows you to do. It allows you to put as much as you can in one turn as possible. And so that leads into the discussion about Rite of Undervault, which I only own one copy of.
Yeah.
And I actually don't really think you need more than one, because the more Rite of the Undervaults you have, the more you're going to draw. And when you're drawing another Rite of the Undervault with your first Rite of the Undervault, you kind of want to cry a little bit, because you have to then dump the rest of your hand, and then you have another Rite in your hand, and you're like, okay, well, what do I do with this? And it's also, one thing to notice is you're also giving back 3 mana worth of tempo to your opponent, right?
Yes.
So the mana that I save with Darkfire Sacrifice is being exchanged for Rite of the Undervault. But if you just have a 3 for 3, if you have 3 Rites and 3 Darkfire Sacks, then you don't have a net mana advantage, right? Like, you then exchange all of the mana that you got back to gain more cards, but then you've lost your initiative, and you never want to lose initiative as Abyssian, because once you don't have anything on the board, getting rid of things on the board is a lot harder.
It's a lot more
because
expensive.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So you can only remove 1 creature for 4 mana, or removing as many as you can. Whoa, okay, so the icon got changed. Wrath of the Unborn does 2 damage to everything and restores every mini's full health, which the full health thing isn't really super relevant, but it's a reason for why the card costs so much, and why Abyssian doesn't do so well when they're off of the board. When they have nothing to play, or sorry, when they have nothing in play, Breath of the Unborn isn't going to necessarily get you the board back. It doesn't universally kill everything, for one. Of course, that would be pretty ridiculous. But because it's a low enough number that by turn 4 there are creatures that can survive it, it doesn't reverse the tempo of the game at all. And it's very specific in its usefulness in that it is your only way of dealing with Jax efficiently, for instance. And Jax is probably one of the strongest cards against Abyssian, because then it splits your ability to remove things into 5 separate attackers that don't take return damage. So a Jax kills a Wraithling Swarm plus has another attack to kill another Wraithling. And Breath of the Unborn is so clunky that it's hard to justify using it for just a card like Jax. But you would need it for so many more things the less influence of the board that you have. So Breath kind of... I would say Breath defines the weakness of the class. It has a really bad AoE spell. And for 4 mana, you might not clear the board. And it does more if you have the board already, but generally you don't actually care about the health of your units. Most of the time, if you have Breath to heal all your guys, you are probably going to win anyway.
Yeah.
Because you had guys to begin with. So, at which point, having Breath of the Unborn probably isn't better than having something else that is a dude.
Yeah.
Is essentially what it comes down to. And just to illustrate my point, the deck that I was using has no spells besides Darkfire Sacrifice.
For the
Wraithling
heals.
Swarm.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, and heals because Songhai.
Yep.
I wouldn't even put Void Pulse in the deck if Songhai wasn't that much of a... Like, Void
It
Pulse
wasn't a
just
thing.
isn't the option I was looking for when it came to that. And I also put in Aquan Lore Masters for the same reason, just to have more healing, because although 9 isn't enough, 15 is okay.
Yeah.
15 gets you somewhere close to where you need
Potential.
to be. But it also has some interesting play to it, and it's probably one of my favorite cards, just as a neutral. because you can steal your opponent's spells. It used to be really interesting against Time Lock based decks or Time Maelstrom based decks in Vitruvian, because if you steal their Time Maelstrom, you're probably going to win. And I had someone steal my Time Maelstrom in a tournament. Oh, actually, I think it was Deceptical that stole my Time Maelstrom. Um, and it was really effective, we'll say.
Yeah.
And there was also a game I had today earlier playing against another song, and I stole 2 inner focuses and killed him with Spectral Revenant inner focused.
That's pretty awesome.
So sometimes you can make really awesome plays within just the class shell itself. It doesn't have a lot of interesting options when it comes to that. You can copy a Wraithling Swarm, which is kind of nice, but you don't really need more Wraithling Swarms. I actually feel like Wraithling Swarm in the later phases of the game doesn't do anything for you. In the early game, it's really nice because it takes up a lot of space. It forces your opponent to have an AoE, but as the game goes later, you really want things that can impact the board, and Wraithling Swarm doesn't necessarily cut it. That being said, still an amazing card. 4/4 with the stats for 3, forces your opponent to have an AoE. Pretty good card, but not in a Darkfire set.
So I want to bring this up because it's usually a hot button topic for the for the faction. Like, how do you feel about Shadow Creep?
I need to test it again for this patch. I didn't really. So the biggest issue that I had with the Shadow Creep were just basically any card that I can just go to neutral, right, and find a card that completely destroys it, then I'm probably not going to use the card.
Yeah.
So that's my main justification against ever wanting to run a Shadow Nova deck legitimately, is that you can just use Lightbender and kill all the Shadow Nova tiles. Goodbye.
Yeah.
And that was your whole win condition, because it's a 7-cost card that you need to run 3 copies of.
Yeah.
Although, something that I was considering was, in an Arcanist deck, you can run less copies and just copy it with Lore Master. And it frees up deck space for other things. But the other cards that generate Shadow Creep are very slow. Although Abyssal Crawler is nice. Like, I don't think I have any problems with the card. It doesn't fit in most of my deck archetypes at the moment. I feel like it's much better if you have a Shadow Creep deck than if you don't. And I actually don't run the card in any of my Abyssium decks right now, because I'm not running any Shadow Creep decks.
Yeah.
Because Lightbender exists. So as long as that happens, no dice. But I do feel like there needs to be something like that to exist, so that Shadow Nova has some counterplay to it. Because if you look about how Shadow Nova functions, it's just an inevitability win condition. And if the guy's running 3 Tracers and a bunch of Spectral Blades, how are you even gonna win unless you're Songhai and you can just burn them, right?
Yeah.
So, but I guess going back to burn in general, and it's kind of it's a very slow burn deck if you want to look at it that way. That's all really that Shadow Nova is just a slow burn deck.
Yeah.
Reducing its cost would be okay, but if you do that, then Shadow Creep becomes oppressive, because at 6 mana, it's a 4 damage AoE and an inevitability win condition. It's just too strong if you make it any weaker.
Yeah.
But the main limitation to the card, I feel, is that you most likely need to run 3 copies of it, which means you don't have deck space for much else. And it can't be accelerated in the same way that creatures can, right? You only have... the only way to mana accelerate outside of class-specific mana acceleration cards is Crystallis and Mana Forger. And neither of those cards accelerate enough mana to justify your Shadow Nova turns. And that means that you already had those creatures in play before this happened, because otherwise they don't really pay for themselves. You need to cast 2 spells in order for Mana Forger to pay for itself, right? And if you're running a Shadow Nova deck, you're only going to cast the 1 Shadow Nova. So it's not efficient on its own, but it also has to survive. Oh, did I miss something?
Makes sense.
Oh, okay. There's my chat thing lit up. Are we running out of time or something? I know.
No, we're good.
Okay.
No, it's okay.
Okay. I'll go on for as long as you want me to.
No, let's talk about Magmar. This is good stuff.
Okay. Oh, whoops. I'm on crafting mode. Okay, so Magmar. So Magmar, if we're talking about from a design perspective, I would add card draw to this class, um, just to increase the consistency of it. Um, Maybe some other card could be hit somewhere. If anything, maybe I would say maybe the weapon goes down to +5, um, or something like that. The thing with this class is that they have a lot of explosive capability with Flash Reincarnation and with Quadrata, which isn't really a super strong card by itself, but it used to have a place when you were vomiting out 4 cards a turn, right?
Yeah.
That's when Magmar made sense from a design perspective because you could use the acceleration and not feel bad about it. Now you do because this is a card that makes like it mana accelerates you for 0 mana, pretty nice, but it costed you a card to do it, and you don't have ways of refilling your hand like Abyssian does. And you also don't have things to make this card more efficient. So in Abyssian, you can sacrifice a Wraithling to get your mana acceleration out, or you can sacrifice Sarlacc. And so those things make sense to sacrifice from an Abyssian standpoint, but nothing really pops for Flash Reincarnation to justify the acceleration that it gives. So it accelerates for 2 only, but it's 1 card, and it's a card that you're not getting any cards back. So maybe Flash Reincarnation should draw a card, actually. Or Dampening Wave. One of these 2 cards should draw a card. But in general, 0 mana cards that draw a card aren't terribly healthy for a game because there's no drawback to using it ever. Like, I could Flash Reincarnate nothing, and I would still be okay with it because my deck now went down to 39 cards or whatever. And so every other option that I go or that I'm going to draw into, I have a higher chance of drawing into it. So it increases the consistency of my deck by default, even if I don't use it properly. Like, I'm sure you've seen Songhai's use Mana Vortex and not cast a spell.
Oh yeah.
Like, that's because a card is so good, they don't need to cast a spell. There's no drawback to using it. It just happens to draw you a card as well. So either the card should cost mana or it shouldn't draw a card. But they want it to draw a card, and drawing cards is something that's being introduced slowly into the game. And maybe Songhai is kind of like their guinea pig. Maybe I went off too much about Songhai not keeping it in perspective of, well, okay, they're tweaking Songhai so they can see how it affects every other class and how it affects Songhai as a class. But
yeah.
Unfortunately, I feel like the burn issue needed to be tackled before the card draw issue was.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, sure, Songhai can run out of cards, and so they're just top decking in the end game, but why do they care if most of their deck is damage, and they're most likely going to top deck damage, and the reason why they vomited their hand in the first place is because all those spells only did damage anyway. So there was no reason for them not to vomit their hand.
Yeah.
So what the other card was supposed to the spell increase card, 8 gates, right?
Yeah.
That one was supposed to encourage Songhai players to hold their cards, right? That's the direction they want Songhai to go. Is so now you have a little bit more efficiency and a little bit more options. Let's see if you use them, but there's no reason to because Burn's too good. But in terms of back to Magmar. Sorry, got distracted. Somehow Songhai became a
the
word.
Songhai training comes out.
Yes. Okay.
0 cost cantrips, they'll do it to you. All right.
Okay. So maybe no 0 cost cantrip. Maybe that's not a cool. Not maybe that. Maybe one of these cards can draw a card. Or Flash Reincarnation can cost some. Well, no, that wouldn't make any sense. So Flash Reincarnation, no cantrip, has to cost 0, or else it doesn't make sense as a mana acceleration. So maybe Dampening Wave, or maybe even Dire Tide Frenzy. Honestly.
Yeah, I could see it on Dire Tide Frenzy.
Because that by itself, like, you can't make full use of it almost ever because you're not going to necessarily be in position to frenzy something right away. And for the most part, as the game goes later and later, and you need to play this on a creature too, so as the game goes later and later, there's a higher chance that your opponent's also playing around Frenzy. So it would make Dire Tide Frenzy a little bit redundant, but Frenzy itself as an effect is extremely powerful. Like, if you have nothing on the board, you can't play around Frenzy at all. There's actually no way to play around Frenzy if you cannot play, other than airdrop, I suppose.
Yeah.
There's no other way to play around Frenzy if you have nothing on the board. When you do have something on the board, you can kind of space your general out 2 squares to the side and 1 square down, and you're good to go. Just as an example, you put You have to put at least 2 squares in between you and anything else in order to play around Frenzy. Because if anything is 1 square within another minion, it's going to get Frenzied, right? The other way to deal with Frenzy is to taunt in front of their general so that they need to kill or deal with the taunt first in order to get their Frenzy unit to move. Is another way that you can handle it. And also, when you use Frenzy, you always attack the lowest attack unit. If you have a taunt nearby, they're forced to take the highest attack worth of damage, regardless of whether they're Frenzy, which is one of the stronger things about Frenzy, is that they can choose how much damage they take. And it's probably the strongest thing about the class, is their ability to use the Macintor War Beast to completely flip the board state on its head, right? And then they have to deal with this War Beast as well, and sometimes they have to hit it because the War Beast killed everything.
Sometimes for free.
Sometimes completely for free.
Thanks, obelisks.
Right. Obelisks are like negative cards against Magmar. Plus, they can just be killed instantly. But okay, let's go back to like I guess just discussions about the class here, because I think this class is really cool in a lot of what they can do, and there's a lot of interactivity. Like you can play around natural selection, you can play around Plasma Storm,
Yeah.
And you can somewhat play around Frenzy. Vindicator adds options for the Magmar to make plays on their own turn, right? They can plan out their turns. There's a lot. It encourages play on both sides. I feel like playing against Magmar is one of the most rewarding experiences because I know that both players are playing in the game. If that makes sense. Like there was an interactivity that I don't feel when I play against Songhai or even Lion, honestly.
Yeah.
When it just feels that they're low on interactivity because they're all upfront about whatever happens. Like they just dump their cards on you, and that's it.
Yeah.
There's not really like playing around it. And in terms of Lionar, actually, now that I'm talking about Lionar a little bit more in depth, is the thing with Lionar is you don't know what threat they're going to have next. Like no matter how you deal with whatever threat that you dealt with every time, and most of the time you can't kill everything on the Lionoir's board every turn. Their units are just very tanky. You end up leaving something on the board every turn, but you don't know what's going to come out next. Almost every time it's like, well, they could play an airdrop, they could play the 3/5, they could play like 3 dudes, or they can play some really fat legendary, or equip a weapon and start hitting me. There's just so many things that they can do on their end, so many options that they can put in their deck that you'd have to look at their deck list to know what they can play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And for Magmar, it's kind of the same way in some cases where you have like you don't know how free you can be about or how reckless you can be about your removals. So because they have the option of playing fast with Adamantite Claws and Macintor Beast, that's really all they need to rush you down. And so everything else in their deck could easily be slow cards, and you couldn't really tell so much from their early game unless you see less of certain cards. Like maybe you don't see them playing as many weapons or something like that. Like maybe it would allude to control, but it's really hard to tell.
Yeah.
But even despite all of that, overall it feels like there's a lot of play involved on both sides of the Magmar versus anything matchup, where it wasn't like that before. Before card draw changes, both players just vomited their hands, and Magmar had a Macintor War Beast, so you would get screwed randomly.
Yeah,
and that was how that matchup went.
Not to mention Magmar Golems, which I don't know if that was before your time, but
I played against a Magmar Golem deck before I knew how to play the game, and it felt really like, oh my god, he's just throwing creatures at me every turn. That was it. And it felt kind of frustrating, but kind of like it was interesting that someone came up with that. It was like, sometimes you gotta give a person a healthy amount of respect, regardless of how badly you're getting crushed and how you feel like you can't do anything or whatever.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like, man, that's a really cool deck idea. Like the other day, I played against a Songhai, and before I could break my keyboard, the guy started playing Mechazor pieces, and so I was trying to like put my keyboard back together because I wanted to play the game,
Yeah.
And then there I was playing the game against a Mechazor Songhai. I was like, man, that's interesting because you can use Mistwalking to give yourself more pieces.
Yeah.
And at the time I thought you could use Inner Focus on. I was like, oh, that's a really sick combo. Now I figured out it's actually just immune to everything, so
Yeah.
you can't use your own spells on it. But I thought because Vitruvian has a card similar to that is also magic immune, but it's only immune to your opponent's spells, so you can buff it. So I thought that's how Magic Immunity worked until we actually tried to test a Songhai Megazord deck. Like, oh man, that sounds so interesting. And
Yeah.
then you can't interfocus the
Yeah.
cards. So I was like, all right. Well, that experiment's
Well, if it
over,
doesn't
but it
have
was
rush, then okay, fine.
right, right. It's not as big of a deal, but I do actually. You know what is also a really interesting Megazord deck is Magmar because Magmar can accelerate their pieces and they can actually give the thing rush.
Yeah.
Like, I really want to see someone do that. There's a lot of things I really want to see people do because I don't have any cards. I just have 7 Abyssian decks or 9 or whatever, just messing around with what I have. But like, there's so many cool things that you can do in this game. I'm just like excited, you know.
Yeah, one of the interesting decks I saw on the forum today was apparently until they changed the way that you copy units, people had a Mechazor deck where they would ephemeral the Mechazor and then fractal replicate it to get
Yeah.
more Mechazors that actually had the
Yep.
ability still.
Yep.
I thought that was actually pretty clever.
Yeah. Although I think that replication was actually a huge nerf, unfortunately, because one thing that was really interesting about like classes that dealt with Magmar in an indirect way is that you could use Fractal to recreate the card in its original form, unsilenced or whatever. I guess unsilenced is pretty much the only thing that you can replicate in terms of negative effects, because there are no other real like super huge negative effects you could replicate out of other than Blind Scorch, I guess. Um, that being said, Fractal allowed you to play through removals. So there was a tournament game I had the other week, I guess. I was playing at Strasbourg, and on turn 3, I think, turn 3 or 4, he summoned a Dark Nemesis, and I couldn't kill it, but I could silence it. And the whole rest of the game, he's like, "Oh man, I wish I drew Fractal so I could unsilence it and kill you." It's like, "Oh, yeah, that would have
That would have
sucked."
sucked a lot.
That would have sucked, but fortunately, it didn't happen.
And now that's not the case. Like you wouldn't be able to do that currently now with the changes.
Right. So it would be less useful to use a card like, because I feel like that's really the only way you can deal with Dark Nemesis is by silencing it, because it just has too much health.
Yeah.
If you can deal 10 damage by turn 7, you could have probably dealt the damage to their face. That would have been a better way to win, right? If you ever have to kill Dark Nemesis like straight up, you might be in trouble. And if ever you can, then that's even bigger trouble. Like in that last game that I played, where we got it out, I was still at 4 health. So I mean, if he drew cards that did damage, then I was dead. But you got to do what you got to do. But generally, by that point in time, it's like make or break, right? Like you have to deal with it or you're screwed, and that's how most legendaries should be, right? With Silithar Elder, either you deal with it or more Silithar Elders come out, and then you have more to deal with. And eventually he'll just take over the whole board because those Silithar Elders will also generate more Silithar Elders, and eventually it's just like, oh god. And that's pretty cool, I think. Like it adds an extra threat to the board. And I guess I didn't really get to talk about it a whole lot. We were talking about Vet and how like legendaries need to be able to do something when they hit the board because it's so late in the game that it's getting time to like close the game out.
Yeah.
And Silithar Elder kind of toes the line of that usefulness where it doesn't do anything on the turn that you play it, but it is threatening. Like they actually need to deal with it. Or the Magmar can just play from across the map, and if they have enough healing, you're probably not getting through that until you deal with their threat. But that's also kind of a side effect of Magmar having 30 healing in their deck, or potentially 30 healing, so they can play a super long game if they want to. But not all other classes have that option. Although there are certain classes that could probably use Silithar Elder even more. Like, could you imagine Silithar Elder in Lionar? Please, no. Or an Abyssian. Yeah, let's have more dudes. For less mana too.
Yeah, Rebirth and Abyssian would be disgusting.
Yes. So it's okay that it's in Magmar, but it toes the line where certain classes could definitely do more with this card. But I'm glad it's here. It still does what it still does a lot for Magmar, but I feel like Magmar could use I guess, a better card than Silithar Elder. If we want to talk about like endgame legendaries, they kind of have to pull farther than that to get more endgame out because this isn't enough by itself to like close a game out. It's just a really big guy
Yeah.
that they need to kill at some point in time. But if killing you is a better option, they're just going to kill you. And that's the same issue with Osrix. That's the same issue with, let's see, Abyssian Legendaries. Well, okay, Reaper of the Nine Moons is a little expensive. Old Spectral Revenant used to be that issue, right? But, like, it just doesn't do enough.
Yeah,
on
no
the
one
turn
played it.
play. And Ostrix has the same problem. I would say that the Lionar Legendary kind of has that issue, although it's kind of nice, but it's definitely like worse than a general. Like
Yeah.
either way, they have to deal 8 more damage to your general. That's honestly most of what it does. But it is kind of a cool card. Like I really do like it because you do permanently have 5 more damage until you die. But what would be interesting is if you could buff it, like because it's a minion, right? So is he still a minion when he becomes your general? That's something I don't know if people have messed with a lot. But
Yeah, you're just like,
but he's not
you're just
super
like
huge threat on the
Lionheart's
board.
permanent zeal. Like,
Well, maybe not Lionheart's because it like you are. I guess you'd be in the same space. Maybe you can zeal it because he's technically maybe
he's next to himself.
he is himself.
Yeah, exactly.
And Elix Stormblade is kind of like it taunts. That's pretty good enough as far as on the board immediately does something. Vitruvian on the board immediately does something with Imara Healer and taunting. Now Songhai is weird with their legendaries because this one immediately does something, 8 gates, but Mask of Shadows it does if you're trying to play it, but it's awkward. Like it's not universally playable either.
Yeah. It's like you
You
need something else to set it up, like a silhouette tracer or something. Usually, like you're not
Yeah.
finding your general behind their general a lot of the time.
Right. That one I feel like is interesting. I kind of wanted to make a deck based around this card actually because, like you said, Tracer is a way to do it. Another way is to just simply block them. Uh, if you have enough dudes, you can just block them until you're ready to go. And if you have enough taunts in your deck, you probably could get them stuck in one position, getting backstabbed repeatedly until they die. And like these things stack on themselves too, so I mean, you could get pretty good, but you can't use a thing like inner focus on yourself, so it's not like god tier or anything. But it's
Man,
interesting.
did 3 of those, the 3 Saber Spine seals, you're set, man.
Yeah, dude,
It's like
easy.
it's like 17 damage.
Yeah,
It's so much setup, dear God.
but yeah. Tuskboard does something immediately. Heaven's Eclipse is a spell, does something immediately. Like the only one that doesn't is actually Stormkage, and it's like, why would I use this card? And once I figured out what the lightning did, I was so disappointed because it takes up space in your hand,
Yeah, if it's sitting around.
and
yeah.
you can mulligan them, I guess. But the
Yeah,
the
beyond
funniest
the
part-
super gimmicky infinite combo, it's not very amazing.
right. The other funny part about it is yeah, I guess you can infinite with what is it?
Mana Forger, Prismatic,
Walking?
and then that.
Okay.
Because what you do is the Prismatic summons a dude every time, which gives you a Kage Lightning, and then you can just Kage Lightning
just
the
say from
Kage. Yeah,
hand.
yeah.
Right,
so you just
right,
you just basically keep hitting the same dude, and you just keep getting Kage Lightnings back and cycling them.
That's interesting. So if you had a mask on, you'd just kill them, like no matter
Yeah.
what, they would die.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you had Blood Leech on, or if you had a 4 Winds Magi
Oh,
on the board too, but
God.
that's so much setup that
Yeah, exactly. Though one thing that I could see in like buffing the card is making it an Arcanist, and then putting a neutral card that reduces the cost of the next Arcanist that you summon until it dies or something like that. I feel like there needs to be more done with mana, or cores, I suppose we can say, when it comes to Arcanists, because that's kind of what they're built around is spells. But you often find yourself with really strict either mana limitations or card limitations, one or the other. And although they give you cards or they give you like some form of mana acceleration, there's just not enough of the two.
yeah.
And mana accelerating minions on a neutral isn't something that's been well looked at yet. But if we made him an Arcanist and made him able to be casted for cheaper, that may make him, or just I don't know, just make him cheaper would maybe be better. But there was one time where I mind controlled this, like when I first started the game,
Yeah.
because I wanted to find out what the lightning did. I thought it was gonna like hit their general or something. I don't know, or maybe. But then I found out it was just like do 5 damage to something, and I tried to kill it. I tried to kill off my own minion because it was taking up space in my hand, and I couldn't get cards back because it was giving me lightnings. And eventually, I drew a silence, and I silenced it. So
you actually had a bad reaction to it, basically.
yeah, but that was only because like I wasn't Songhai, I was the Vitruvian that stole it, so
Yeah, so
I didn't have
this tells
nearly
me
as much
no good.
usefulness,
Yeah.
right? That being said, Arcanist Vitruvian is something I was really hoping would become more of a thing because you can make Bone Swarm cost really low amounts, so you can cycle it for 0, you can make Fountain of Youth cost 0, and so you could not necessarily infinite, but you can get close, right? Although I had a deck before, I guess, pre-patch with Time Maelstrom Infinite. I don't know if you heard about that. Some people were very dissatisfied with how the deck played.
Can you Alcuin Lore Master it?
Yes. I Lord Mastered it 3 times every game that I could. And I was like, all right, here you go. Watch me play the game. And still, despite all that, still couldn't beat Songhai.
Yeah.
But C'est la vie. As I found out, it was actually still a deck building mistake the way I built it, but it was still like a learning experience. Like, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So even though I hate Songhai, blah blah blah, but it's still like, oh, I could have put more useful things in my deck, so I wasn't like stuck on dead hands, while the other guy is accelerating, or like they're pushing their win condition. Like that's what they wanted to do, so that's where they were. And I was sitting there like, sick, a combo I can play in 6 turns. So there's kind of a combo syndrome that you can get sometimes.
Yeah.
With certain cards, and if you noticed that the deck that I had showed you earlier, the one with Darkfire Sacrifice, actually doesn't have any tech in it at all. It doesn't have any removal. It doesn't have anything besides my own win condition in the deck. And so all it cares about is doing what it's going to do. And it makes the liner matchup really hard, but it makes it really interesting for something like the Mirror, where they have to spend more mana than I did to remove one of my minions. So like if I spend 1 mana on a Frenzy guy and I made him into a 6/6 or an 8/8, that's about as big as you want to make it most of the time, by the way. Because after that, you're needlessly sacrificing tokens to make a bigger unit that's simply going to be removed. And if they don't remove it, they're probably going to lose anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like making it bigger doesn't really change that much. Sometimes it's an edge case where like, should I make this a 10/10? Should I make this an 8/8? Sometimes it just isn't relevant. Like one time I made a 10/10 on turn 2 against a Songhai, and he killed me. So, like, it's neat sometimes, but sometimes you just get inner focus 3 times on a Chakra Avatar, and then double wake up and you're dead.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Okay, sorry, I did it again. My salt just seeps through my veins.
Yeah, you just call them Saltai for you. It's fine.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to go into the neutrals about, I guess back on like where they fit into certain classes. Like I would love to see Mercblood Devourer be in some deck, but it's too costly.
It's too fragile.
It's too fragile for what it does. If you have 2 of them, it's pretty cool though. Because you can kind of like place them 1 square away from each other and then place 1 minion in between and make it super buff. Or there's actually 3 spaces that you can double buff a unit with 2 Mercbloods, but yeah, it's not tanky enough. I guess 3 health. All it needs for it to be okay is for it to be a 1/3. Honestly, you can use it with like rush units or something like that.
You use it with rush units, or you could. I mean, even like a cheap combo would be like you play this in a bunch, like a Wraithling Swarm, right? And you get a bunch of 2/2s, right? Or
well, unfortunately, 2/2s are about as useful as 1/1s.
Yeah,
they both die to the same thing.
Hey, but if you have 2
Mercblood, they don't die to Ghost Lightning. I was considering putting Mercblood Devourer in my deck against Song, but it just doesn't do enough by itself. So it's like a combo syndrome again, where you have this card that does something with a lot of other cards, but like by itself, it's you toss it back, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of where a lot of cards are, and you can make an argument that an overtech deck probably won't win against the matchup it's teched against. Like, you might end up with too many ways of handling answers, but no way to win the game.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've had that actually more of with the less experienced players that want to play against me as like a practice experience or something. They're like, hey, let me test my deck against you. I'm like, yeah, sure. And then they have like 15 spells in it. And they're like, why isn't my Lionar deck winning with 15 spells? I'm handling all your minions. And I'm like, yeah, but you're also drawing the wrong spells half the time because
Or
you
your
have
hand is
16 of
just
them.
spells.
Yes,
You have
exactly.
nothing to
And you're just
buff.
like, oh, that I'm so unlucky. My hand is just spells. I'm like, dude, that's because you made your deck with so many spells. Your chances of drawing them are so insanely high. And it was also, I guess, kind of the conundrum that Abyssian players came to when Rite of the Undervault got buffed was, how do I use it? Because if you tech your deck to be useful with Rite of the Undervault, it's useless without it.
Yeah.
Um,
You basically just gas yourself and you're like, okay.
yeah, and the other problem is like, all the tempo that you gained because you're playing so many cheap guys is completely negated by the amount of cards that you can draw every turn without Rite of the Undervault. And then when you actually draw it, you just exchange 3 of the mana of your tempo to get your cards back so you can do it again. And like none of your options are strong enough to push the game. They all die to really simple things by that point. Um, I mean, what's that? The Magmar card that does 2 damage to everything. God, that card crushes you if you can't do anything to it. Um,
Oh yeah, the Spirit Harvester.
yeah. Fortunately, by that point in the game, like you should be able to play enough threatening guys. But that's where the whole Abyssian with Darkfire Sack comes into play, and Darkfire Sack kind of plays into the Rite of the Undervault plan more because you won't necessarily gas yourself if you have big creatures. Although not a super huge fan of Reap of the Nine Moons. Like it seems good in theory because like, oh sweet, it summons a dude, and it could end up being their one of their 12 to 15 2-drops,
Yeah.
which is the most statistically likely case, right? So statistically, it's going to be bad.
But it could be
Like,
Dark Nemesis, bro. I mean,
oh,
who
it
knows?
could be. It could.
That would
be.
actually be the best.
Yes, probably one of the best. I also wanted to mess with Nether Summoning with all. If there were more charge creatures in this game, I would play Nether Summoning with all charge guys, and then Nether Summon 3 more charge guys and kill them with it.
Yeah.
But other than that, it just has a really high chance of giving me 2-drops.
Yeah, just giving
Because
you
2-drops
poo.
are pretty necessary right now.
Yeah, it's like you want to have early plays.
Right. And right now, I guess before when like pre-patch, I guess pre this patch or no, a pre Song High change buffs, pre card draw over. Oh no. Okay, pre card draw additions. There you go.
Yeah.
I guess pre vet nerf. There you go. Pre vet nerf. I could actually run in the corner as vet in turn 1 and be okay with it. Because I could just stack obelisks in the corner, and eventually, no matter what they played, I was getting free value out of everything I was playing, like Blast Relics and the Blast Guy. Like, those guys can be played in the corner, and I'm getting free value out of them. So that the mana that they gained wasn't relevant. And I had answers to everything they could play, because there's really easy answers to almost anything that's playable in the game as Vitruvian. You have Siphon for anything that you need to silence. You have Blind Scorch for anything that has attack and can hit you. And that's all you need for a majority of creatures. And if you need to buff or debuff a bunch of them, Drain Morale. Done deal. And so you had ways of neutering things from all the way across the map, and you didn't really have to care. And I guess post-nerfs, you don't have as much of a late game to actually do that. And so you need more early drops, and so that's where you see these kind of mid-rangey vet decks with Amara as like the end of their curve. Sometimes they have Time Maelstrom, sometimes they don't. But that's where the decks are going now, as far as vet goes, because they can't afford to be as late gamey because they don't have something to rely on, like a Time Maelstrom Infinite or something like that. Well, not Infinite, but like a Time Maelstrom extended ridiculousness. But that's as close as you ever got to a late game, like a super late game deck outside of like Magmar Control, which I guess is the closest thing now. And their late game win condition is more of an inevitability than anything. Whereas Vitruvian had an explosive late game, where they could, whenever they got what they wanted, they could just completely destroy you.
Yeah.
And that was their thing. But obviously that was a bit too strong. At the mana cost that it was at, it was like, oh.
And it wasn't fun that it cost. Yeah, that it was at the cost of like, oh, like we win because you get no more turns anymore. Like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it just didn't feel interactive. And I feel like that's something that I hope that the game designers are striving towards, interactivity. Like, the class who must not be named aside, interactivity seems to be a strong focal point for the game, and I feel like Magmar has it right, as far as interactivity goes.
Yeah.
If some of these things are hard to play around, like Macintor Warbeast, pretty hard to play around, but you can play around it.
Yeah.
They're AoE, you can play around it. I have definitely held swarms knowing that I was going to get stormed, or the opposite, forcing a storm so that I can play more stuff. Right? Like that's interactivity on my end. And if I'm the Magmar, and this hasn't really come up for me in particular or anyone that I've talked to yet, but like, what if you pretend you don't have Plasma Storm and you just let them come to you and they play more dudes and you're like, ha ha, you thought I didn't have it. And then they're playing more of an efficiency game and their control game is being, well played on their end. Like, and that's more of a game. You're playing a mind game between each other. Do I have the storm? Do I not have the storm? Do I have the charge? Do I don't have the charge? Because when you play around, or rush, I rather say, when you play around Vector Warbeast, you're not playing to your win condition a lot of the time because you have to avoid this gigantic value play. But if you successfully do it, Magmar has dead plays on 5. Like, that's his only real play on 5, other than like play a Colossus if he has it in his deck. And that thing is slow. It's a really slow card compared to Warbeast. But if you play around Warbeast, what do? Generally, they have to have some other plan that involves more cards. Like, if they want to accelerate an Elder on 5, they need another card for that. If they want to play 2 guys, they need another card for that. And Warbeast is generally what they're working towards on 5. And so playing around that feels really good. If I play around a Warbeast and then he plays it anyway, and I'm like, gotcha, it feels really good. And at the same time, setting somebody up for a really sick frenzy feels really good as Magmar. And that's kind of like where I would like to see the game go, is interactivity. And like I said earlier, like, do I have the storm? Do I not have the storm? That kind of shit with Abyssian, that kind of stuff with Abyssian. I don't even know how many times I've said things, but as far as Abyss goes, there's a lot of interactivity there too. Is how many guys can I afford to kill while also accelerating my win condition, or playing to my win condition rather. So there's some times where you can't kill everything without gimping yourself, right? Like, say if I have to play really costly ways of dealing with this. What if I have to Lion to kill off 2 Wraithlings, right? That doesn't seem optimal, but sometimes it is. But sometimes, if I'm the Lion I need to save it, how much is this going to cost me? And you can math that out from the Lionheart perspective. I'm going to take 9 damage from these 3 Wraithlings around me if he has an activator. That's how I look at it. Is there's a lot of math involved in the Abyssian matchup, but it's completely transparent for the most part.
Yeah.
The only parts where it gets kind of in the realm of non-interactivity is whether they've drawn really ridiculous Darkfire openings. Like, if I get out a Dark Nemesis on turn 2 and you don't have an answer, you just lose, right? Like, that can happen. And so that's also an interactivity. I guess an interactivity no-no is if they're able to do so much and you can't respond to it. But at least Dark Nemesis, there are definitive answers for it. Whereas for Songhai, well, I did it again, there's only so much healing that you can have. And certain classes just can't have any more.
Yeah.
And that's where it's at. I would like to see a neutral heal card, and we'd be set. Maybe even on current Songhai, because then it would at least force them to think around healing.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
I've watched a few songs play out of morbid curiosity, and it seems like they usually get frustrated when people heal, and I'm just thinking that I'm like, you kind of have to expect that that's possible.
Exactly. But it's like you said, it's in the way that they build their decks. Like, I, as a Songhai player for a long time, I've rotated to like more like heavy control. I play Eclipse. I play like Onyx Mirror Steel, stuff you mentioned before, because eventually there is going to be a day where I can't just spiral tech my way out of like all these problems, and I also
Right.
find it's more interesting and fun for me as a Songhai player to
Hmm.
like have a card like 8 gates or think through my spell combos and get damage out of
Right.
Blood Leech Mask and other ways of controlling the board versus just being like, okay, well here's my 5 damage to your face, here's my 3 damage to your face, here's like
Right. And
that kind of
it's
stuff.
not interactive on both sides, right? Because like,
Yeah,
what if they have more green numbers than your red numbers? You feel pretty useless. And that's how the Lionel versus or Burn Songhai matchup goes.
yeah,
And it's actually much different in Songhai Control versus Lionel Control, right? Like, I don't know if you've actually gotten that deep into Songhai where you've actually played a control mirror. It's a lot more interesting, because there's a lot more to think about. Because now you have Songhai as being able to double remove things with Phantom and it's still living, or my God, I wish this card had backstab. Like backstab for 0 actually would be kind of interesting, right?
yeah.
If you could backstab something and instantly kill it and not take return damage,
That would be huge.
that would be a play.
Yeah,
Um, I'm sure that they're kind of, I don't know like what their opinion on the class is as of now. I felt like there was definitely a plan in mind. Like they have a plan for the class, they're just kind of tiptoeing around it at the moment.
yeah,
Um, or at least that's the feeling that I got from it. So it's not like this is the end game for them. Like I feel like we've seen the light as far as their design chops goes when it comes to other things and interactivity.
yeah,
And this is just kind of their uh-oh, I guess this is what happens when we retract, or when we take a step back from this class and look at it as like, okay, well, now that the card draw has changed and they can have 6 card combos that can one shot you or something like that. I mean, that kind of got changed too, but point being, there's a lot of ways for a song to deal a ton of damage now, and it needs to be looked at from okay, well, what do we want to do about Spiral Tech? What do we want to do about Phoenix Fire kind of things? Because like I can even see Phoenix Fire getting a hit somewhere, even though it's actually like number wise completely fine, but within the frame of the class, it's not, because it's just more damage on top of the damage that they have. Like anything would be good, right? Like if you look at 8 gates, yes, it's a buff to Songhai, right? But it's not like a super significant buff because it's a card they're introducing while people can buy it because they're going to introduce more. They're going to do more with Songhai's ability to use spells on things.
yeah.
It just doesn't really make sense otherwise, because 8 gates only interacts with 6 spells. No, 9 spells. 9 spells. But 3 actual spells, right?
Yeah, I
Or
mean, no one's gonna play Twin Strike. Like, no one's
yeah,
gonna pay
and
6 to deal 4 to 2 things.
right, not if you can. Yeah, not if you can deal 10 damage for 5.
Yeah, or 14, right? Or 14 for 7. Like,
Exactly.
so I don't know if
So
you know this, but Spiral Technique actually used to be 7
7
damage and
damage.
7,
I heard the rumors.
and Phoenix Fire used to be 4. So
Oh
like
man.
they have brought them down, but like yeah, when I heard that I was like really, and then like Inner Focus used to be 0. So they've
Maybe
actually
that's
like
why.
they've
Maybe
moved.
that's why they haven't nerfed the class at the moment, because they're not sure how far they can go, because they've already taken a step in the same direction and they're like, well, we don't want to just keep doing that, right? They
Yeah,
want to come up with more elegant solutions, or at least maybe from that perspective, maybe they want to do something else, but I don't know what that is, and maybe we'll have to see. Because this patch was very light, right? They just had a little bit
they're
of
letting
fixes,
everything
like
marinate
here.
after their 20 plus card changes.
Right. Because there's
Yeah,
still a lot of marinating to be done, and they don't feel like people got
yeah,
what they put out, or at least that's the message that I got from all that, is like, or someone made a post about it, and Eric Lang was like, you guys still have a lot to go over, which I agree with. There's a lot of cards that we probably haven't messed with, and for some of us, it's an accessibility problem.
yeah,
Because some after the reset, there was a bit of a spirit and shards that everyone after the phase 1 players got, and
yeah,
that was all we really got, and that just got completely scrapped. So we lost the bonus that we would have gotten. Right, it was kind of like a bonus to say, oh well, here's a little bit so that you can stay relevant because everyone else has been playing for months and months, and like,
yeah,
you need to be able to do something. And it still wasn't that much, but it was nice. But we got reset after, and we had nothing to do.
yeah.
And so for a lot of us, we still don't really have access to the things that they want us to find out. And it's more up to the Phase 1 players with the 8K plus gold or whatever they got to mess around with some of the things that they thought we would catch on to.
Yeah, for sure. So let's actually let's rotate out of this